Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 7th International Conference on Practice Research, which will happen next year on the 7th, 8th, and 9th of July, 2026. In leading to this exciting event that will happen next year, our committee thought that would be useful for us to organize a series of 6 pre-conference webinars. So this is the first. And today we are very privileged to have a very solid, a very powerful, if I don't know what other words I can use to describe our panel, represented, our speakers are represented from different countries and regions, but all are practice researchers and who have been working on practice research for a very long time today. So far, we have about 235 people who have registered. I think people are coming in as we are starting. And of these 235 people who registered, they are from 29 countries and regions. Without going through, I have just typed their names here for you to see and have a sense. Most of these people, about 50% of the 235, if not more, are from Singapore. So to my fellow citizens from Singapore, welcome to this webinar. And we are very privileged that this international conference will be held in Singapore next year. So Singaporeans like myself and my colleagues in Singapore will try to ride on the energy of this conference to promote practice research in Singapore as well as the region. And there is also quite a big group of people from China who have registered. About 40% or 30% of our 200 over registrants are from China. And I don't know how are they going to log on to the Zoom, because Zoom is not widely used in China. In fact, it's illegal. Okay, what will happen today? Basically, this is a Zoom mode, and we have chosen a Zoom instead of a webinar mode so that we will be able to hear your voices literally during the Q&A. So we would prefer you to use your mics, which are currently muted, but don't worry, we will on the mic for you later on to raise your questions. For those who do not want to speak up, please put your questions into the question box only. We are leaving up the chat for people to say hello and to be connected. So we are keeping the chat just there. And presentation will be sent to all of you with the once we confirm the permission from all speakers after today. Most of our speakers have already said yes to it. So the panel will take about 60 minutes. Since there are 6 presenters, each will have about 10 minutes, and I will be helping our panelists to keep time. I think that's about it. We will wrap up after our discussion, and I will give you some announcement. So this is what will happen. So without further ado, I would like to begin our presentation today by getting Prof. Lars, who will be talking about why we do practice research and what is it, followed by Martin, who will be looking at uniqueness of practice research in relation to other research in social sciences and beyond. And Prof. Mike will be comparing the unique methodologies in practice research and other research. And then Sara will be looking at the unique roles of relationship in practice research. And Prof. Bowen will be looking at the uniqueness of practice research in education. Last but not the least, we have Lynette, who will be focusing on the uniqueness of practice research in relation to impact and change that social work focuses on. Lars, you ready? If you are ready, please take over. I will stop sharing.
Right. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, it's seen now. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you very much for making it possible to participate in this. As you said, Tim, I will talk about why we do practice research and what it is. Of course, there is a diversity in these understandings. So this is based on my experience, and I will actually start by quoting Ben Flubier, who we have used several times, because he's saying that no individual is actually skilled enough to give sufficient answers, meaning that we don't have the answer as researchers. We have part of the answer, but we need other people to be involved to give more sufficient answers. And he's also talking about research and practice, meaning researchers, practitioners, and service user producing knowledge all together. So I think that's a kind of a basic understanding. Besides, what I see is that research is not something in its own bubble. Of course, it's part of the society and also hence part of a democratic societal processes where people, citizens are expected to be included in as many part of these processes as possible. And of course, practice research is also a part of this agenda. And to me, in its own DNA, has the potential to support more democratic processes. And the reason why I say this is that if we look at what could be called the DNA of research in general, it includes a distance towards the phenomenon being studied. So normally we have to be a little far away from what we are studying, but the DNA of practice research is actually to reduce the distance and to support inclusion. A third argument is that societies need new kinds of processes in knowledge production. Normally, we are used to the top-down knowledge production, where we at the universities, we produce the knowledge, we do the research. But as Gredig and Sommerfeld says, if we want scientific knowledge, especially empirical evidence, to play an effective role in professional action, we need to have a focus on the context where the processes take place. And I would add, with the people working with or being influenced by research findings. So to do research, and especially to do research in social work, we need to be focusing on the context and on the people involved in this. And you can say that if we look at social work practice, vulnerable groups in society, they are in need of the knowledge coming out of the research. But it's also goes the other way around, that we need the expertise of social workers and vulnerable groups to qualify research. So there is a need in many ways for practice research. So what is practice research? Well, I'm leaning on an old definition done by Ian Shaw almost 20 years ago. I have changed it so many times that Ian probably wouldn't recognize it. But just to say that this is my understanding of practice research, it's any disciplined empirical inquiry, including research, evaluation, analysis, but it's also theoretical conceptual analysis conducted by or negotiated between the researchers, the practitioners, the service users, intended to shed light on, support learning process, or explain social work. So it could be small projects, it could be quite big projects with the purpose of qualifying social work through new knowledge or to develop social work actions. So that's my kind of understanding of what practice research, which is quite a lot, but also that it needs to be able to help to develop social work. I have been talking about 4 different approaches, and I'll just mention them very shortly. One is practice research on social work, which is, you could say, directed by the researcher, but the researcher has to be connected closely to practice. So is this phenomenon understandable in practice? Can it be turned into a research question? Is it possible to collect the data in practice? And is it, which is very important, possible to apply the findings in practice? The second approach is what I call practitioner research, and I'm leaning towards Irvin Epstein and Professor Ramian. They are talking about inspired principles from research to answer questions originating from practice and giving answers back to practice. And Ramian is talking about a phenomenon that occurs when practitioners commit themselves to something they call research in their own practice, while they at the same time do social work. Normally, he's talking about 20% research and 80% social work practice. The third approach, participatory practice research. So the first one directed by the researcher, the second one directed by the social workers or the practitioners. The third one is a more collaborative part where the stakeholders, they develop every part of the process in common, discuss the research question, the method, the analytic process, and so on. So everything is discussed. Research becomes part of a learning process where you could say that practitioners or service users will manage the learning process while the researchers will manage the research process. And finally, the fourth one, service user focused practice research, where the service users can be either consultants, that could be in practice research on social work, where the researcher is leading the project. They could be the research holders, where the researchers and the practitioners more become the consultants, or they can be the stakeholders in the participatory approach. Now, these approaches are prototypes. So they are, to me, it is to help the stakeholders to discuss, to help to choose a way to approach what they are going to study, and to discuss the roles in the process, because there are different roles. Doing it together doesn't mean that we have exactly the same role. There will be different roles. Rather than trying to make the collaboration fit into one of the approaches that I have presented. So most practice research approaches will not be clean, but place themselves in what we have called in one of our latest articles, in between 2 or more of the approaches. The important thing is to have the discussion of between which approaches. So this discussion of the in-betweens is a very important part of the negotiation that must go on between the different stakeholders. Also, when not only doing the participatory approach, but also the other approaches in practice research. And this becomes part of what I call dialogue, a dialogical research communication, which is needed to have these negotiations. We need this discussion. So through this dialogical research process, knowledge is shared and knowledge is developed collectively.
Lars, you have about a minute to finish.
I have already finished, Tim, so no
You may want to
problem.
wrap up then, if you have anything more to say.
Yeah, but just to say, of course, this is a very short presentation, but I think it's very important that in practice research, we discuss exactly why do we need practice research, or do we need something different? And what do we mean when we talk about practice research. And hopefully these different approaches can be a help in this discussion.
Thank you, Lars. Now, I suspect our audience will get more and more overwhelmed and more confused as our speakers come on and give blows of their wisdom and experience. But I think they are connected one way or the other. Next, we would like to invite Prof. Martin Weber from University of York, UK, to talk about the uniqueness of practice research when it is compared to any other research methodologies, methods, or in social sciences and beyond. Martin, if you are ready, please take over.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for this invitation to speak at this webinar. I will build upon what Lars has said, and as Tim said, hopefully not confuse you further. But as this webinar is in relation to the uniqueness of practice research, I'm going to speak about other forms of research, which as social workers we draw upon, we may use and we undertake, but may not be characterized as practice research. So just in my understanding of practice research, which is very similar to Lars's definition, that first of all, it arises from social work practice and informs social work practice. It starts and begins in practice. Questions are generated from issues, problems, or observations originating in practice, and a wide range of methods are used. It's often conducted by practitioners, or at least usually involves practitioners. As Lars said, it can be conducted by researchers with practitioners, and it often involves service users or carers as more than just participants, as active investigators or involved in directing the research. The findings of practice research are, of course, fed back into practice. Now, in relation to other forms of research, this may or may not be controversial. It may be that you may agree with this or disagree, and that's absolutely fine. But just thinking about what practice research is not, it's if you are undertaking a literature review or a desk-based piece of research without a method, or it's purely conducted in relation to ideas or theories, or it's directed by the researcher with no reference to social work practice or practitioners, I would argue that that isn't practice research. But if you're undertaking a scoping review or a systematic review with a particular method, and you're answering a practice-based question and your findings feed directly into practice, then that would be categorized as a form of practice research. Or it might be a systematic conceptual review of a practice-related concept, and the need for the review arises from practice and the findings feed back into practice. So I would argue that that would be a form of practice research. So, for example, this is rather small, but this is just an article on social education in Thailand, providing a historical perspective. It looks at the literature, looks at the origins and the history of social work education. I would argue that this is not practice research, but it's very interesting, it's very relevant, and of course it's very important. Next, in relation to other disciplines, social work draws upon a number of disciplines in its work. We work alongside other disciplines, and we utilize methods which are also used by other disciplines. For example, in terms of sociological research, if it's about ideas or theories, if it involves interviews or other qualitative methods which do not address questions arising from practice, or it's purely conducted in relation to ideas or theories, or it's directed by a researcher with no reference to social work practice or practitioners, I'd argue that that wouldn't be characterized as practice research. But in practice research, we use interviews, we use qualitative methods, and if it's directly addressing a practice-based question, then I would argue that it is practice research, and if it feeds back into practice. So in terms of what practice research is and is not, here's an article from the Chinese Journal of Sociology, looking at the practice of bride wealth. And this is a qualitative study looking at particular cases about this particular cultural practice, which of course is of relevance, it's of interest, and it's important for our understanding, but it's not in relation to social work practice. And therefore I would argue that it's not practice research, although it's an important piece of sociological research. Next, in terms of research around policy and social policy is important, obviously, in social work practice, because it informs what we do and it governs what we do to a certain extent in different jurisdictions. But policy research, I would argue, is not practice research if it does not address questions arising from practice, if it's descriptive, takes a longitudinal view about policy developments, analyzes trends or compares different policy frameworks, and again, directed by the researcher with no reference to social work practice or practitioners. I would say it's very relevant, it's important, and it's useful for practice, but it's not practice research. But practice research itself can have a significant impact on policy if the findings suggest that policies should change, and practice researchers should be encouraged to orientate their findings to practice. So here's an example of exploring social security development in Macau. Again, this is a relevant piece of research published in the China Journal of Social Work. And if you're working in that jurisdiction, then it's important to understand about social security policy, how it's evolved, and so on. So it's very relevant, it's important, it's interesting. I wouldn't say it's practice research. So we utilize a range of methods in social work practice in terms of epidemiology, the science and understanding of large populations. We draw upon many studies using these methods, such as cross-sectional surveys, longitudinal panel studies. But I'd argue it's not practice research if it doesn't address a question arising from practice, or the analysis of variables is conducted with no relation to practice, or it's conducted by researchers with no reference to social work practice or practitioners. But practice research can include surveys or longitudinal studies if they seek to answer practice-based questions and they feed directly into practice. So for an example of this, China Family Panel Studies is a longitudinal study of families in China. Many papers have been published from this, and here's one in the Chinese Journal of Sociology, looking at the relationship between discrimination and psychological distress amongst rural migrant workers. Again, it's of interest, it's relevant, it's important, and it's providing the source data on which we might base practice, but it's not conducted in relation to or answering practice-based questions. So I hope that that's been a little bit of an introduction to different types of research in their relationship to practice research. I'm very happy to pick up on discussion on this later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, you have not even reached 8 minutes, so can I throw in a question here and put you on the spot? So you are saying, I'm jumping to some conclusions and testing you out, that it doesn't mean that social workers, when they conduct research on their clients, would necessarily be practice research.
That's correct. I would argue that it would need to be answering a question which arises from practice, but just collecting data from people and undertaking interviews and so on, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's characterized as practice research.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We have a little more time to play with now that Martin has saved us a minute or so. Let's invite Prof. Mike Austin, someone I admire a lot, to present on the different methodologies in practice research for social work. Mike, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Can you boot up my, can Juliana put up my one pager?
She's doing that.
Great. and big enough for everybody to see? Perfect. So first of all, apologies. I can see that I have not followed the traditional format. I should have put this on the University of California, Berkeley letterhead so that you can see the university I come from. But now that you know where I come from, I can sort of proceed. I'm hoping to build on Lars and Martin's presentation by focusing on how do you do practice research and what are some of the other methods that are related. Martin touched on several of them, as did Lars. So the best way to understand this framework figure is to start down the left-hand side, the first column under methods. And I think one of the things you'll notice as I identify methods here, well, let me just start. First, having to do with framing and negotiating, as Lars talked about, the development of research questions. What are we trying to understand as it relates to practice? Secondly, identifying sources of literature and practice wisdom, meaning coming from practitioners to inform the research questions themselves, meaning we draw on the experience of practice, but we also draw on the literature. Specifying the data collection processes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Defining data analysis and interpretation processes, like when the data is aggregated, how do we plan to analyze it? And obviously that was mentioned earlier. And then one of the most important pieces that I think practice research relates to is implementing a research dissemination process. How does this go back to practice? In what form? And in what context can practitioners appreciate what the practice research actually has generated? And then the last one is sort of articulating the knowledge development process. This is a bit more complicated. It sort of draws on our traditions that come out of social sciences generally, where, as you may know, one of the purposes of many social science studies is to generate new knowledge. It's one of the reasons why researchers tend to find themselves communicating with each other, not necessarily the practice community that we are concerned with. I'll come back to that in a bit, but just wanted to outline these methods down the left-hand side because I think they would be generally described as traditional social science steps in research methodology, not relevant to practice research, but also relevant to other disciplines. So now as you move to the right-hand column, where we talk about organizationally based practice research to improve practice and service delivery. And so here, this is the column that really, in my mind, describes in more detail what practice research actually looks like. Because I think not only are we interested in improving practice, but we're clearly interested in improving service delivery, which obviously takes into account the service users who ideally will be involved. The second box you'll see is organizational service providers, service users, managers, and policymakers. These are the folks who really need to be involved in framing the research questions, as we talked about on the left-hand side. And in the sources, again, for both practice wisdom and literature need to come from organizational members and documents. Documents here refer to what agency documents exist that relate to the service that you're wanting to look at or the problems that you want to understand better. And then as you move further down that right-hand column, when we're talking about data collection processes, it's really important to recognize that we use classic social science tools, interview schedules, focus groups, surveys, case record data mining. A whole raft of tools are used in practice research, that some of which have been highly developed in the social sciences. And as we move further down that column, we want to engage in what's called shared analysis and interpretation with the stakeholders. So for example, in our research, whenever we bring findings back to our practice community, the first question we ask when we present them with the data, how would you interpret this? What do you see in the data? What implications can you draw from this? So it's not just the researcher's responsibility, but it's the practice community's mutual involvement with data interpretation and analysis. Then as you move further down that right-hand column, the whole notion of implementing research is really important because it focuses both on service and on practice. Let me give you one example from my own research. When I presented data to our practice community, this happens to be agency directors, one of the comments I got from them periodically was, well, that's interesting, but what does it mean for our agency? What specific things do you think we should do with these findings inside our agency? And while initially I was put off by that question because I don't run those agencies, they know better than I do. But what they were looking for are a set of recommendations coming out of our data that we think have potential application inside their agency. They can agree or disagree with those, but at least it's a starting point for internal discussion. And then the final step in that right-hand column, we talk about practice-informed theory and theory-informed practice. Now, this is a very large topic, so I won't spend a lot of time here, except to say that one of the things that practice research ultimately can and should do is inform existing theory about how to intervene with families, with individuals, with children, with the elderly, whoever it may be. How does that sort of improve or enhance one's current understanding of how theory operates in those domains? And the same thing, obviously, is how does theory inform the particular approach? Lars cited one of the classic Danish scholars, I think, a sociologist, in the notion of research being concrete, meaning the science of the concrete means it's closest to where it happens, and all the varying characteristics of that. And that's a theory of how this can be informed as well. So that's kind of the right-hand side column. Now, as you move to the second column, where it says community-based participation in action research, this is and I think Lars alluded to this area. This is a method that I have found public health researchers, anthropologists in particular, tend to identify with community-based action research because while they're not operating necessarily from the perspective of practice, they are operating from the perspective of community. How do we involve folks in looking at a community problem? And so what I think is critical in this particular methodology, and I won't go through all the pieces of it, is that it's population focused. And that's in contrast to social work, which tends to be case-based or group-based. Community-based participant action research has as its feature, while it uses the word research, its primary focus is action. And so part of the interesting things about this type of framework is that it parallels what we do in practice research, but it's also different in its focus because it has a very strong community orientation. It doesn't have a particular service user orientation, although it could. And then the last column, which is in the middle there, it says program evaluation and intervention research. These are the more traditional research methods that we do draw on in different ways when it comes to practice research. But the methodology of program evaluation is highly developed over many years, but it's based on the premise of saying, so what were we trying to do here? What kind of intervention were we trying to implement, and how successful was it? Which is a classic decision-oriented or objectives-oriented approach to research. Important, but different, I think, from how we define practice research. And a related cousin to program evaluation that Martin referred to briefly is the whole area of intervention research. And this is the area that you see much more in the health field and mental health field, where RCTs, random controlled trials, are established to test out an intervention and its effectiveness either in the laboratory or in the field. Highly organized, highly controlled. And in social work, we're seeing more of these, but it's still a rare methodology, but common in, I think, classic health and mental health venues. So this is an effort to sort of put different frameworks up against each other to see where they are similar and different. All of them speak to the methods on the left-hand column in one way or another.
Thank you, Mike. You have about one, you have to wrap up soon. Thank you.
And I've just finished. I guess I should add the reference on the bottom of my figure is a book we published on practice research. And this summer it will appear in Chinese. So those who are interested in what we've been doing and talking about here will be able to read about it in Chinese.
Thank you, Mike. I have been using Mike's book as a guide for me to answer some of the questions that appear as I'm trying to do practice research. So I highly recommend the book in English, and thankfully it will be in Chinese this summer. Next, I would also at this point invite participants to put your questions in the question box. The chat box is for you to connect with one another should you identify someone that you are interested to connect with. Next, we would have Sara from Italy talk to us about the uniqueness of practice research in focusing on the relationships in practice research. Sara, over to you. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Tim, for this invitation. I am delighted and also honored to have the opportunity to present on the unique role of relationship in practice research. Throughout my research experience, I have found that relationships truly make the difference in the effectiveness and impact of our work. In this presentation, I will explore how relationships significantly build the quality and outcomes of practice-based research. By the end of this talk, I hope to demonstrate why prioritizing relationships in our research approach is not just beneficial, but essential for practice research. The importance of relationships in practice research is not just my personal observation, but it is also emphasized in several key documents in our field. For instance, the Helsinki Statement on Practice Research highlights that what is critical and interesting is an exchange of perspectives. This underscores the value of diverse viewpoints and collaborative dialogue in our research process. Furthermore, the New York Statement on Practice Research goes even deeper, stating that practice research is relational by its very nature and its human services context. Practice research thus reflects and emphasizes the relationship and the interactions between researchers, practitioners, and service users. These statements underscore a fundamental truth. The relational aspect is not just an add-on to practice research, but is intrinsic to its nature and effectiveness. They highlight how the interactions between all stakeholders, researchers, practitioners, and service users are central to the research process and its outcomes. At the heart of this relational perspective on practice research lies our relationship with data, which is the fundamental object of any research endeavor. This data is embedded within a dimension of reflexivity that emphasizes the logic of inquiry during practice. In this sense, during the practice, each stakeholder engages in a process of data observation, activating inferences and reasoning about it. And it is about the Dewey reflective thought that he said it is the only way to think in a right way. This reflection through reasoning leads to the formulation of hypotheses that are useful for developing practical strategies. Practice research views this process not as an individual one, but as a collective one, emphasizing the importance of group dynamics and confrontation of ideas. This collective reflection transforms the research process into a dynamic, interactive endeavor. By engaging in this collective process, we not only improve the quality of our research, but also contribute to the professional growth of all participants. This approach aligns with the relational nature of practice research we discussed earlier, demonstrating how relationships, in the case among all the participants, these relationships can drive innovation and deeper understanding in our field. Now, let's consider language from economic science to better understand the role of data in practice research. In traditional research and other research methodologies, data might be seen as a consumer good, valued for its direct spendability or immediate utility. This is what we might call its consumer value. However, in practice research, we approach data differently. Here, data is important for its use value, a concept that goes beyond immediate utility. The value of data in practice research is tied to greater goods, which are the relationships it fosters and the insights it generates throughout these relationships. To further illustrate the concept of use value about data in practice research, let's consider an analogy. Data in practice research, I can suggest that it is like a baker's oven peel. Imagine an oven peel that has been repaired over time, carefully maintained, passed down through generations of bakers. This peel acquires value not just from its function, but from its history, the skills it represents, and the relationships it embodies. Similarly, in practice research, data gains value as it passes through relationships, dialogue, and confrontations. Its worth is more closely tied to the relationships built during shared reflection around data than to the data itself. Each stakeholder throughout this process becomes a co-researcher, adding layers of meaning and value to the data. This GIF, now it works, yeah. This GIF visually represents the relational nature of data in practice research. Just as the elements in the GIF interact and transform, our data evolves and gains meanings throughout the interactions and relationships of various stakeholders. Okay. The unique role of relationships in practice research emphasizes the research function inherent in practice itself. But this raises an important question. If each stakeholder acts as a co-researcher, what then is the specific role of academic researchers in practice research? My opinion, academic researchers play a crucial facilitative role in these processes. They have a role in reflection support. They assist stakeholders in reflecting deeply on their work. And academic researchers have a role in theory integration. They support practitioners in adapting and integrating theoretical knowledge into their practice, with an iterative process between practice, research, but also training, education. This aligns with John Dewey's perspective on the relationship between practice and science. As Dewey stated, and I'm going to read, as an act, social work is wider than science. The latter, however, renders those who engage in the act more intelligent, more thoughtful, more aware of what they are about, and thus rectify and enrich in the future what they have been doing in the past. In conclusion, relationships are not just a part of practice research, they are its heart and soul. By embracing this relational approach, we can create research that is not only rigorous, but also deeply meaningful and transformative for all involved. Thank you for your attention and for being part of this dialogue in our field.
Thank you, Sara. You have delivered your speech in less than 10 minutes. I would also like to remind our participants to put your questions in the question box. If the question box is not, a question and answer box is not showing on your computer, look for it in the other. Click the three dots and you will be able to find the question box where you can put in your questions or comments. I would also like to invite our speakers to, when you have the time, look into those questions, and anyone can answer them. All our speakers can. We can have more than one response, agreeing, disagreeing, if with one another even, so that this dialogue can go on silently. Next, I would like to invite Prof. Bowen McBeath from Portland, USA, to talk about where Sara has left, incidentally, on education. So what does practice research looks like? What does practice research look like in higher learning education, in higher learning institutions? Bowen, over to you.
So thank you so much, Tim. Thank you, dear colleagues. So it is a treat to be with us. While at the same time, I must confess that I'm speaking to us from the West Coast of the United States, where it is currently, oh my goodness, it is almost 11 p.m. So it is perhaps an hour and 15 minutes from midnight. So with that being said, I have 3 slides to share with us. So not too many slides, but I hope that these slides will be of interest. As a little bit of context, let me share like some reflections on what we have shared, what we perhaps have like heard up until this point. Lars provided a fantastic introduction on these particular questions, like what is practice research? Why does one engage in practice research? Where does one support as well as participate as well as grow in practice research as practice researchers? Martin shared this fantastic summarization on these following questions. What is practice research? And equally importantly, what is practice research? What is not practice research not? One of the things that we find about definitional issues in the social sciences, in social work, as well as in the realm of social ideas, is that it is important for us to establish some boundaries that involve common definitional issues of what a topic is and what it is not. And Martin has provided a fantastic introduction to that. We then have from Mike this essential question. How in the world does one engage in practice research? How does one do it? And then thanks and courtesy of Sara, we have this emphasis on practice research as relational. And more importantly, not just practice research as relational, but practice researchers, as well as practical theoreticians who are engaged in practice research as focusing on practical relationships. So with that as setting the stage, I wonder if I can pick up and take perhaps about 6 or 7 minutes on this core question. The question of who. Who in particular is involved in practice research, particularly in academic settings. It is a typical aspect of practice research that involves the collaborations between us and our agencies, us as practitioners, us in some cases as service users, service participants, us as carers, us as community leaders, and in some cases, us, as Sarah has alluded to, us as researchers, as scholars, as well as academicians in university academic spaces. So therefore, I would love to share with us the following idea. I would love in particular to talk about two types of people that are engaged in practice research, particularly in order to sustain conversations around practice research. These two groups are as follows. First, us as students, us as trainees, us as agency-based colleagues. So that's one group, and the other group is academics. And here is my core thesis as follows. In order for practice research to flourish in academic settings, we need both groups to collaborate in taking seriously the basic principles of practice research. I will share this thesis one more time so that I can be crystal clear. In order for practice research to flourish in academic settings, we need both groups, that is to say both academics, as well as our colleagues, whom we call students, whom we call trainees, and who we can call agency collaborators. We need both groups to collaborate in taking seriously the basic premises and principles of practice research. With that as perhaps like the basic thesis, let me just run through these slides relatively briefly. So as I shared in this slide, the teaching and learning of practice research generally involves the sharing, the development, as well as the caring of special types of knowledge. This knowledge can be what some people consider to be practical knowledge, as well as practicable. So a euphemism in terms of this type of knowledge, we call this knowledge that is used and useful. Now, what type of knowledge is used and useful? If we're talking about social work knowledge, we're talking about social work knowledge that is applicable to practice, that is relevant to us as stakeholders, and that is seeking to identify methods for enacting change. This knowledge is also seeking to be shaped by us as colleagues in a joint venture. This involves collaboration between us as students and us as partners in agency settings and us as educators. The knowledge is also reflective of what we call issues of context. So it must be reflective of what is involved in the moment, the time, the space, the place, as well as the milieu. When we think about the milieu, we think about the agency-based context of services. We also think about the geographic context, and we also think about larger socio-political and economic challenges that might be surrounding issues of practice, as well as the needs of service users. And then finally, this special type of knowledge is oftentimes seeking to be incredibly considerate of specific theories, methods, as well as areas of substantive expertise. And in furtherance of supporting this special type of knowledge, what we as educators, as well as students, what we seek to do is as follows. First, we seek to steep in practice at multiple levels. This involves what some people consider to be an emphasis on practice at the micro level, practice at the meso level, as well as practice at what some people consider to be the macro level. We also seek to attend to various agency-based and cultural settings. There is not one single setting, even though practice may originate, say, for example, in an agency context. We also have to think about relationships involving other agency partners, as well as the diverse needs of various service users who come from, in some cases, quite different cultural backgrounds as compared to other service users, as well as other times. We also have to consider and appreciate the specific needs of service users. This goes for some people without saying, and at the same time, for us as educators, as well as us as colleagues, as students, as trainees, as well as agency partners. We must always continually emphasize and focus on this basic question, like, what are the needs of service users? Are there ways for us to be attentive to and considerate of these specific needs. We also must draw upon and share varieties of evidence, particularly in relationship to practice. Lars, Mike, Martin, and Sara have provided some fantastic examples of studies, both in terms of different sorts of platforms, as well as specific examples of studies that range from perhaps more qualitative to perhaps more quantitative. From, on one hand, more positivist to, on the other hand, more perhaps interpretivist, as well as perhaps more drawing upon various critical theories. That breadth, epistemologically, phenomenologically, as well as perhaps, what is the phrase, methodologically and practically, is crazy important for us as agencies, is incredibly important for us as students, and is equally important for us as academicians. And perhaps the final bullet that I wanted to share with us on this second slide, before I turn to the third slide, is very important. This gets at something that some of us consider to be one of the hallmarks, one of the essential features of us as practice researchers, whether we are students, whether we are agency partners, or alternatively, whether we are academics, as instructors, as researchers, or as servants. This critical process involves the questioning of authorities in the gentlest way. So this is not necessarily a very strong, very abrasive approach to questioning authority. This is a very participatory, a very relational, and a very appreciative way of asking this following basic question. Are there ways for us to improve? Are there ways for us to improve our current approaches to delivering services to this specific service user? Are there ways for us to listen better? Are there ways for us to provide perhaps like different, if not perhaps more ethical, perhaps more participatory forms of care? These are essential elements of what we do as practice researchers.
Bowen, you have less than a minute to finish this slide. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. And I'll take this last minute then. So then, in conclusion, and I will share this as follows. So therefore, what we tend to do as academicians, as well as students, what we tend to do is we tend to focus in very small scale initiatives. These are oftentimes in the form of seminars in which formal roles, say for example, as professor and student, are balanced as appropriate with oftentimes less formal roles. So one of the less formal roles might be as follows: as colleagues, as co-investigators, as co-explorers, as well as co-leagues, as colleagues. Where, once again, as Sara reminded us, it is important for us to focus both dialogically as well as collaboratively. And once again, in furtherance of this basic question, how are there ways for us to listen better to service users as well as to the perspectives and the needs of practitioners, while at the same time we seek to continually hone and strengthen our skills in both evidence-informed practice as well as our basic approaches to research, both qualitative as well as quantitative, as well as theoretical. So thank you all so much. I will stop sharing at this point.
Thank you, Bowen, for, first of all, summarizing and connecting your presentation to our previous speakers and making your presentation really cohesive for the whole webinar here. Last but not the least, I would like to invite my colleague as well as a friend, Lynette, from Melbourne, University of Melbourne, to share with us about the impact and change when it comes to the uniqueness of practice research. Lynette, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you so much for this opportunity to speak to such a diverse and international audience that we have here. I've been fascinated by watching all the people being admitted into the webinar this evening. So I'd like to say welcome to you all, and to say that this evening I'm actually going to look at what it is about practice research that offers something to the practitioner, something where they can look at how their practice is demonstrating both impact and change in the services that they're offering. And to do this, I'm going to turn to yet another definition of practice research. And this evening, we've been treated to a wide range of understandings of diverse aspects of practice research. But I'm going to go back to a single factor in a definition that was developed by Erwin Epstein, well known to all of us in the practice research field. And I would like to emphasize the question, that the research question is co-developed by practitioners, practitioner researchers, academic researchers, service users, and that the question comes out of practice and is of relevance to practice. And this really defines the unique role that practice research plays in impact and change. Because when questions are relevant both to services being provided and to the people using them and the people providing them, the outcomes of any research will impact back with far greater impact than a research question developed esoterically by either an academic or a practitioner in social work. So my first point that I would really like to emphasize is questions from practice, and that these then facilitate impact once the research has taken place. Now, social workers, and I find this constantly in my collaboration with them, know when they bring about change in practice. They understand the tremendous benefit that they're offering both to the people using their services, to the organizations in which they are working. And they bring about change in practice through a wide and diverse range of services within a systems context. They might do and affect change by responding to client life situation needs, by making a comprehensive contribution to service users and their families, by contributing to service outcomes through community care, by providing effective engagement with community resources and linking people effectively to networks of community resources. And then my final one is utilizing a diverse range of skills and competencies to respond to service user needs. In an audit that I did of 532 health social workers in Victoria, here in Australia, I found that there were 88 different reasons why people were referred to social workers across Victoria. What a diverse range of issues that social work is dealing with in a variety of different contexts. And it is this that leads us to utilize practice research to demonstrate both impact and change. And as I said, when we focus on the practice, focus on questions emerging from practice, we have a far better understanding of what that impact and change looks like. So how do we usually know that social workers are achieving in their practice and achieving the results with clients that they really want to understand? Do we have knowledge always about this? Do we rely on self-report? Do we get feedback from service users themselves who demonstrate their understanding of what is happening with them, who talk about the changes that they're experiencing? And most importantly, I feel, is are we visible enough to show what we are doing both to our colleagues within our organizations and how we are doing this very important and significant work as a social worker? And it's here that practice research can offer us this unique opportunity. Now, very often, if we look at theories of implementation and of interventions and how we can understand impact and change, we see the results in innovative directions that are coming as a result. And practice research very often results in some of these. For instance, an advanced scope of practice for social work. In a recent study that we've undertaken about bereavement models of care, looking at people and families who suffer bereavement very suddenly and are bereaved unexpectedly within health settings, we have developed a scope of practice with families that demonstrates how this resonates with basic social work values and principles implemented within a very complex system. Social workers can lead services in multidisciplinary contexts, develop co-created services, develop networks of linkages, or do innovative programs that will implement policy directives. Questions from practice and the practice research methodologies that you've heard about this evening can result and are demonstrated visibly in these changes in innovative social work directions. If we think about visibility, we can think about the need in social work to do credible research. And once again, practice research offers that wonderful opportunity to link the work that we are doing from practice, the questions coming back from practice, meaning that the distance with our outcomes of this research is not so broad as it might be with academically driven questions, but rather is close to practice, close to practitioners, close to service users and service providers. And so research becomes credible, becomes close to the services that it is trying to change, and the distance between the outcomes of the research that we are doing and the change that we want to achieve in social work, the effectiveness of our interventions. And just looking at one of your questions that came up in the question box, one of you asked about effectiveness. How can practice research demonstrate effectiveness in research? And I would say that by reducing this gap and having questions that come out of practice that are linked to both practitioners and service users can demonstrate effectiveness back into practice because of the closeness of the research to practice itself. Very often, visibility that occurs as a result of social work research results also in social work leadership. We are concerned about leadership. We are concerned in our profession about workforce issues, about having values-based care, about the well-being of social workers in the workforce, about offering services in rural and remote areas, thinking of advanced practice. We can be leaders in these areas through the impact of practice research that demonstrates how these issues in our social work profession can be reinforced by credible, significant, and understandable research. So I think one of the very big chances for us in the profession through practice research, and one of its unique outcomes, is to actually strengthen social work leadership as well as social work services, because it increases our visibility through the strengthening of our services. Finally, I'm going to look at this implementation pathway. And I actually took these 3 stages from classic implementation science, which is becoming so prevalent and so commonly used in all aspects of research. How can practice research offer a unique perspective on this implementation pathway? First of all, there's what I call the pre-research phase, the practice issue. And it's here in co-creation with practitioners and service users in a democratized process that Bowen described so beautifully to us, where we're all players in this process together. Questions and methodologies are developed that fit in a co-created way and resonate with relevance within the practice issue. Then the intervention. This evening again, we've heard, especially from Martin and from Mike and Lars, about the range of methodologies that resonate with practice research. These can be systems focused because we are working and researching in complex systems, practice driven, complex, and as Sara reminded us, always relationship inclusive. So practice research offers us this methodologically pluralist approach to research. It opens the doors and removes us from thinking rigidly about having to make our research designs fit this very complex situation. But it opens the door to us to allow us to think in a pluralist way. And then finally, effectively strengthening practice, the
Lynette, you
change
have
that
to
can
wrap up soon.
occurs. How much have I got?
You have passed the time. Thank you.
Oh, well, I'm just going to say one thing. This can be iterative. It can be process as well as outcome. And of course, one of the huge changes is the leadership that happens as a result for social work in practice contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynette. Sorry, I have to hurry you and all our panelists too. As I've mentioned in the beginning, I think each panelist would need a lot more time to explain and explore and also elucidate what they are saying. This is just the beginning of this webinar. So we are going to have more to come so that we will be able to continue to think about some of these issues that have emerged. Next, I would like to get to know our audience. Apart from Singaporeans, which is the majority of people who have signed up, apart from Chinese from mainland China, who is the second majority of our registered participants, for the others, can you type into the chat box where you are from? We have 27 regions, and we know that those who have registered may not necessarily be joining us. I would really appreciate it to acknowledge your presence from different regions. So if you are not from China, not from Singapore, please type in where you are from. Thank you. Now, we will now open this time for people to ask questions. I would control time. We have some questions in the question box already, and our speakers are beginning to answer them. So before you open up your mic, which you can on your mic, we have the function of allowing you to speak up. Ask your question in 1 minute and ask only one question, and only one of our panelists will give you an answer. And when time permits, we can come back to you, and then we will move on to the next audience and speak up. I don't know what would happen when we on all your mics, but let's see. Anyone with a question before we look at the questions in the question box? Please on your mic, introduce yourself, ask your question, one question within a minute.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Jimmy. I'm from Singapore. I'd like to ask what mindset and beliefs are essential for achieving the greatest impact and driving meaningful change in the practice research, like what Lynette has mentioned. So what kind of attitude should a stakeholder adopt in effective implementation, because talking about participative research? Thank you.
Lynette, would you like to answer, or anyone else would like to?
Your statement, Jimmy. I think that part of research, when we incline to think outcomes and effectiveness, but in actual fact, what we should think is process and the effectiveness. So what I was really trying to highlight is that the process of engagement with practitioners, with policy, with service users, when you start by doing that, and you know that you're actually engaged on the same page as your, that you work out an arrangement regarding the question, and it becomes this democratic process, which I think we were all really talking about in one form or other. The chances of your outcomes being effective because of this engagement, including with policy providers. For instance, our bereavement study was done in conjunction with our Department of Health. And so it was done, and also with NGOs in the community. So I think that this encourages effectiveness and outcomes, because you're engaged from the beginning. You're not suddenly saying, please accept what we found.
If I can add one thing, I totally agree with Lynette, and also I think that we can underline the importance of collective reflection, dialogues, and confrontation about what is knowledge, about the knowledge that we are considering. I talked before about data, but this is the idea to use the knowledge from the research inside the practice. So it is very important that this knowledge is used in processes of confrontation and dialogues between all the stakeholders involved. This process enhance the thinking from each stakeholder, and this thinking process can change the understanding about how to realize practice.
Thank you. And may I encourage our speakers, our panelists, to look also into the question box and answer any questions you like as well. In this case, we'll be able to address some of the concerns of our audience. Next, anyone would like to speak up on your mic, introduce yourself, ask one question within 1 minute. Anyone? If not, then I would like to, I know the questions are answered. Anyone? If not, then I would like to highlight two similar questions which are answered by our panelists already, and that is to do with ethics. There were two participants who asked about issues of ethics, which I think it's also awfully important. Can any of our panelists highlight the need, if there is any uniqueness to ethics in practice research?
I would argue regarding ethics that the same principles apply in various forms of research, but because practice research by nature is slightly different, and the role of people who are using services, people providing services in the research process is slightly different, that they do not only participate in research, but perhaps undertake it or collaborate with researchers in undertaking it, then I do think we need to think about issues of exploitation and the ethical implications of that. So, for example, in the UK, it's widespread practice that we involve people with lived experience, and people who are providing services in undertaking the research as members of the research team, or as members of an advisory group, or in other ways which they can inform the research rather than just as participants. We don't have ethical frameworks that govern those processes. We have obviously institution review boards or ethics committees which govern the practice of research in collecting data and analyzing data. But we don't. I mean, we utilize, I suppose, professional good practice in ensuring that colleagues in the research process are treated fairly and equitably. Whether or not we need a process to undertake, is a good point for debate, but I still think the same ethical principles should apply in terms of how we work together, how we treat each other, and how we deal with information, for example, from each other.
Thank you, Martin. There are 4 other questions in the question and answer. Before I go to these questions, I would like to offer the opportunity to our audience to speak up. Anyone would like to ask any questions? Please on your mic, introduce yourself, ask your question in 1 minute. If not, then I would like to move on to several questions that are not answered incidentally, and they are somewhat similar. So I would just read from Pei Ling's question, which I think would answer the other 3 questions somewhat. Or maybe I'll read Pei Ling and Wee Peng's question. Pei Ling's question to our panelists. Thanks for the wonderful sharing. I would like to check, deriving from practice research, does it mean that innovative concepts will be developed and practiced based on its contexts through also and also engaging the stakeholders at the same time? Innovative practices based on context and engagement of stakeholders all at the same time. Wee Peng asks, is practice research defined by the content of research, in other words, what, or the process, in other words, how, or who are involved, in other words, who, by all 3 aspects? So this is one part of his question. So opening this up to our panelists to respond to any part of these 2 questions that are connected.
I can share also some experience from my research projects. I said that in my research experience, relationships are very important, and relationships intended as a place of confrontation and dialogues. During this dialogue that and this confrontation and reasoning that start from knowledge, data, research findings, there is the opportunity to develop new understandings because thinking together helps in understanding better the context, the processes, the issues, and in this way it is possible also to really create new meanings and so to create innovation that could be used in the local context where we are developing the reasoning and the confrontation, but that it could be absolutely, it is useful also in developing new research knowledge.
Thank you. Can I add on to Sarah's question in answering that 2 questions in Singapore's context? In family service centers, and there are like 49 of them in Singapore, I think in Singapore, our colleagues are very focused on outcomes, on evaluation, what is working. I think Wee Peng's question is a good one. What about processes? For example, in the family services, there are many Chinese workers, but in Singapore, we have Indian clients and Malay clients. And oftentimes, our clients will not continue for a very long time because they do not find the services helpful enough. And engagement, in this case, is an important issue for family service workers who are mainly Chinese to be able to find out as a Chinese, how can I engage my Malay clients or my Indian clients? So the process aspect or the focus on process is as important, if not more important, than just looking at outcomes. So this is, I think, in our context and where practice research can also flourish, where we look at both processes and outcomes. And very importantly, in order for Chinese like myself to be able to engage my non-Chinese clients, how can I do it? The innovative processes of engaging, I think, needs to be informed by my colleagues and my clients who are non-Chinese. So I think that's just a more concrete example to answering innovation, context, who, and what do we do in practice research. Anyone else of our panelists? We have another 1 to 2 minutes, and then we will wrap up today's webinar.
So this
One of the
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Go ahead, Bowen. Go on. No, I was just thinking, what do we mean by innovative? To whom is it innovative? So I struggle with that, but I think one of the things we discovered in a big project we did studying the implementation of welfare reform in the United States, where we sent out students to capture case studies of innovative practice coming out of the implementation of a massive national program reforming welfare. And the goal there was to capture innovative practices emerging from incentive dollars given to local agencies for reducing caseload. And so it was interesting to sort of capture those innovative cases, which we then put together in a book, as well as some articles about it. So I'm not sure when we say innovation, what we mean by it, but that's at least one example from my experience.
And just building off of what Mike shared, I'm also like wondering about like the nature of the innovation. And in particular, I'm wondering about this following question. Innovation from whose perspective? So particularly from the perspective of service users, I think it's very important for us to recognize that there are some significant differences between practice research that focuses on the positionality as well as the needs of service users on the one hand, as compared to, say, for example, process evaluation, formative evaluation, as well as in some cases, other forms of like service evaluations that really focused on the perspectives of groups of service users. So I think that in comparison, practice research is much more attentive to specific matters of like how we support service users to define their own needs, to listen, how we as practitioners, as service providers, as carers, can listen more intentionally. So it's a very different quality as compared to like standard definitions of innovation from the perspective of evaluators. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Bowen. We are having another 2 minutes to wrap up this event, so we can let Mike and Bowen to bed. And it's about 7 a.m. in the UK now, and about 8, if I'm not wrong, Lars, at Europe for Sara as well. So it's a very unique, if I may use the word, privilege for us in Singapore, in China, and in this region, and colleagues from South Africa and Middle East and everywhere, to have this opportunity to interact at different time zones, but on a webinar like this. This is connected to the event that will happen next July on 7th, 8th, and 9th. In fact, on the 6th, we would have some master workshop. And based on all these webinars, we will continue to plan for this for this conference. For example, we may have master workshops to deal with some of these emerging issues and concerns, so that we will be able to delve deeper in a master workshop before the conference on the 6th of July to have more dialogue, discussion, and debate. So do join us. We will be opening the call for abstracts on the 1st June this year to 30th September. Registration will start next January on the 2nd and closes on the 30th of April. And if you have any inquiries, please write to my colleague, Ms. Juliana binti Abu Rahman. The email is there. Now, this is the first of 6 webinar that is coming up, and there are 5 more coming up. The next one, it's by Lynette, who is present today. She may be thinking of changing this topic, but nevertheless, it will involve the 12 steps of doing practice research. And then there are all these other topics, which I'm not going to go into. If you were to scan the QR code here, you can sign up for all these remaining or coming up webinars at one go. And then we will also send you another reminder, but for the individual webinar, so you will receive more information. So for today, you can sign up for all of the coming webinars at one go. We will also continue to give you the QR code for registration, one after another webinar. So thank you very much for joining us from around the world at different time zones. We hope to see you in the next webinar. If you do not wish to receive any more of our information, send us an email. We will exclude you from our bulk mailing list. Thank you again for being with us today. This is a very exciting event. There was a question about sharing even the videotape. Yes, we will be producing this and put it on our website. I would like to say at this juncture that incidentally, all our panelists and speakers are board members of the International Community of Practice Research in Social Work. So we welcome you to also visit our website and join us. There are many other things that are happening. So do join us for more dialogues. It is icprsw.com, and that is the website for the International Community on Practice Research, which I have put here for you in the chat box. Keep in touch with us, keep connected. Let's go forward and find out more and do practice research together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
morning, good afternoon,
you.
and good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Well done, Tim.
Yes, well done, you. Can we stop recording? Yes.